The velvet-lined jewelry box that once held my mother's heirloom pearls sat empty on the kitchen table, a mocking reminder of the life I no longer recognized. My grandmother, her eyes sharp as flint despite her 80 years, didn't look at the box. She looked at my frayed sleeves and the way I was cradling my 3-week-old daughter, Lily, in a faded, pilled blanket that had seen better days. It was a humid Tuesday afternoon, and the air in her small cottage smelled of dried lavender and old books, a scent that usually brought me peace, but today only served to highlight the stench of my own desperation. "Daria," she whispered, her voice trembling not with age, but with a cold, growing realization as she touched the thin fabric of my sweater. "Where is the $200,000 your father left in trust for this baby's future? And why are you wearing shoes with soles so thin I can see the pavement through them?" In that moment, the air in the room turned to ice. Just that morning, my husband, Mark, had kissed my forehead and told me with a strained smile that we couldn't afford to turn on the heating because the investments were still tied up in a volatile market. I had believed him, just as I had believed every excuse for the past year. But the look in my grandmother's eyes suggested that the floor I was standing on wasn't just shaky, it was non-existent. To understand how I ended up shivering in a drafty cottage with a hungry infant, you have to understand the life I had before. My father had been a cautious, successful man who built a boutique architectural firm from the ground up. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left me with a comfortable inheritance, a debt-free condo in the city, and a specific trust fund designated for his future grandchildren. I was his only daughter, and he wanted me to have the security he'd spent his life building. Mark entered my life like a sunbeam during a storm. We met at a gallery opening 6 months after my father's funeral. He was charming, a high-end real estate developer with a smile that made me feel like the only person in a crowded room. He didn't seem interested in my money. In fact, he often insisted on paying for our lavish dinners and weekend getaways to the coast. He talked about legacy and stability with such passion that I felt my father would have approved of him. Within a year, we were married. The wedding was a dream. Lilies of the valley everywhere, a silk gown that felt like water, and the promise of a lifetime of protection. Our first year was the picture of domestic bliss. We lived in my condo, but Mark suggested we rent it out and move into a larger suburban house to start our family right. He found a stunning colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden that smelled of jasmine in the evenings. "It's an investment, Daria," he'd say, spreading blueprints across the mahogany dining table. "We'll put it in both our names, but I'll handle the mortgage and the taxes. You just focus on being happy." I was so blinded by the glow of new love and the exhaustion of my first pregnancy that I didn't question why he needed me to sign a stack of routine financial documents while I was still foggy from morning sickness. Then there was Evelyn, Mark's mother. At first, she was just the typical, slightly overbearing mother-in-law. She was a woman who draped herself in silk scarves and wore enough gold jewelry to rattle when she walked. She lived in a high-rise downtown that she claimed was bought with her late husband's life insurance. She was always just dropping by with unsolicited advice on how to decorate the nursery or how to manage a household. She had a way of looking at my father's antique furniture as if it were junk, and often made subtle jabs about my lack of financial ambition. "You know, Daria," she'd say, sipping expensive Earl Grey in my kitchen, "Mark is the brains of this family. He has a vision. A woman's job is to ensure the man has the resources to make that vision a reality. My husband always told me that a wife's greatest asset is her trust in her husband's signature. At the time, I thought she was just old-fashioned. I didn't see the way her eyes lingered on my designer handbags, or the way she meticulously noted every piece of jewelry I wore. The transition was so gradual, I didn't even notice I was sinking. It started with small things. Mark suggested we consolidate our accounts for efficiency. Then he mentioned that the condo wasn't renting well and that we should consider selling it to pour the equity into a surefire commercial project he was developing. I hesitated. That condo was my last physical link to my father, but Mark held me close and whispered about the empire we were building for our unborn child. He was so convincing, his voice a smooth balm that eased my anxieties. By the time Lily was born, the atmosphere in our home had shifted. The jasmine in the garden had been choked by weeds because the landscapers hadn't been paid. The house, once vibrant and warm, felt hollow. Mark was rarely home, citing late-night meetings and liquidity crises. Whenever I asked about our savings or the trust fund my grandmother had helped set up, he would become uncharacteristically defensive. "Do you really think I'm that incompetent, Daria?" he'd snap, his face hardening into a mask I didn't recognize. "I'm trying to secure our future. If you keep pestering me for every penny, you're going to distract me from the big picture. Do you want Lily to grow up in a shack?" So I stayed quiet. I stopped buying new clothes. I started frequenting thrift stores for baby gear, telling myself I was just being frugal and environmentally conscious. I hid my growing fear behind a smile, even as the refrigerator became increasingly empty. I didn't want to admit to myself, or to my formidable grandmother, that the golden life I'd been promised was beginning to flake and show the rust beneath. But as I sat in Grandma Sophia's cottage, looking at my daughter's blue-tinged fingers because I couldn't afford a warm coat for her, the veil began to tear. The quiet life I thought I was protecting was a facade, and the man I shared a bed with was becoming a stranger who smelled of expensive cologne, while I smelled of sour milk and desperation. Grandma Sophia didn't wait for my answer. She stood up, her joints popping in the silence, and walked over to an old roll-top desk. She pulled out a heavy, yellowing envelope and slapped it down next to the empty jewelry box. "I called the bank yesterday, Daria," she said, her voice like a gavel striking wood. "I still have my connections there from when your grandfather sat on the board. The trust fund isn't tied up in the market. It was emptied 3 months ago. Every single cent. And the person who signed the withdrawal forms wasn't you." The world didn't just tilt, it inverted. I felt a cold, oily slick of sweat break out across my collarbone as I stared at the yellowing envelope. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air in the cottage, once sweet with lavender, now felt thick and suffocating. I reached out a hand, my fingers trembling so violently I could barely grasp the edge of the paper. "Grandma, that's impossible," I whispered, though my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone far away. "Mark said the trust was being managed by a new firm. He said we needed to let the interest compound. He showed me the statements." "He showed you pieces of paper he printed in his office, Daria," Sophia said, her eyes fixed on mine with a pity that hurt worse than a physical blow. "Look at the signature on that withdrawal slip. Look at it closely." I pulled the document from the envelope. It was a photocopy of a bank authorization form. There, at the bottom, was my name. The loops of the D, the sharp tail of the A. It looked like my handwriting. But I knew. I knew with a terrifying, bone-deep certainty that I had never held a pen to this paper. I looked at the date. It was 2 weeks after Lily was born, the same day Mark had brought me a congratulatory smoothie and told me I looked exhausted, urging me to take a long nap while he watched the baby. He drugged me, I breathed. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. He didn't just lie. He waited until I was at my weakest. As the shock began to settle into a cold, hard knot in my stomach, the memories of the last few months began to reshape themselves. I remembered the early warning signs I had so desperately tried to ignore. 3 weeks ago, Evelyn had come over wearing a brooch I hadn't seen before, a stunning sapphire set in platinum. "A little gift to myself," she'd purred, stroking the stone. "Every woman needs a bit of sparkle to get through the day, don't you think, Daria? Though I suppose you're happy enough in your practical clothes." I had been too tired to care then, but now I remembered the way Mark's eyes had flickered toward the brooch with a look of frantic warning. I remembered the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly whenever I walked into the room, and the way Mark started carrying his laptop into the bathroom, locking the door behind him. "I need to go home," I said, my voice suddenly sharp and clear. "I need to find the rest of it." "Be careful, child," Sophia warned, her hand resting on my arm. "A man who steals from his own child's future is a man who has already justified every other sin. Don't let him know you know. Not yet." I drove home in a trance, the baby sleeping fitfully in the back seat. When I pulled into the driveway of our beautiful colonial house, it no longer looked like a home. It looked like a stage set, a hollow structure built on a foundation of theft. Mark's car wasn't there. He was supposedly at a closing for a new luxury development. I walked into the house, the silence ringing in my ears. I went straight to the nursery, but not to check on Lily. I went to the closet where Mark kept his extra luggage. He was a creature of habit, and he always thought he was the smartest person in the room. He wouldn't have destroyed the evidence. He would have archived it, convinced he was untouchable. My hands were numb as I hauled down his old leather briefcase from the top shelf. It was locked. I didn't care. I took a screwdriver from the kitchen drawer and pried the latch open with a sickening crunch of metal. Inside, I didn't find investment portfolios. I found a thick blue folder labeled Project Phoenix. I sat on the floor of my daughter's room, surrounded by stuffed animals and soft blankets, and began to read. My pulse thundered in my ears, a deafening rhythm that matched the rising horror in my chest. Project Phoenix wasn't a development project. It was a systematic plan to liquidate my father's entire estate. There were the sale papers for my condo, sold 6 months ago for $300,000. I hadn't seen a dime of it. There were the transfers of my father's architectural firm's intellectual property to a shell company registered in Evelyn's name. But the most devastating find was a series of emails between Mark and his mother. "She's starting to ask questions about the trust," Mark had written 2 months ago. "I told her the market is down. She's so tired from the baby she believes anything. But we need to move the rest of the liquid assets before Sophia gets suspicious. The old woman still has friends at the bank." Evelyn's reply made my stomach turn. "Don't be so weak, Mark. Daria is a spoiled girl who doesn't know the value of what she has. We're simply putting that money to better use. That South Shore property is a gold mine. Once the title is in my name, we'll be set for life. Let her play house in that drafty museum. She won't realize the walls are sold until we decide to pull them down. The world began to blur. A cold, prickling sensation spread from my fingertips up my arms. I felt like I was watching my life burn from the outside. Every kiss, every I love you, every promise of a future. It was all a calculation. I wasn't his wife. I was his mark. My daughter wasn't his child. She was a tool to keep me distracted and compliant. I heard the garage door groan open. Mark was home. I looked down at the documents scattered around me, then at Lily, who was beginning to stir in her crib. My legs felt like lead, and a wave of nausea rolled over me. I wanted to scream, to throw the briefcase at his head, to demand he tell me how he could look at our daughter and see nothing but a paycheck. But then, I remembered Sophia's voice. Don't let him know you know. I forced myself to stand. I gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the broken briefcase, and shoved it back into the closet. I wiped my face with the hem of my worn sweater, took a deep, shuddering breath, and walked out of the nursery just as Mark's footsteps sounded on the stairs. "Hey, honey," he called out, his voice smooth and warm, the same voice that had convinced me to sign my life away. "You look pale. Did you have a rough day with the baby? Why don't you go lie down, and I'll take care of dinner. I managed to scrape together enough for some takeout, a little treat for my hard-working girl." He reached out to touch my cheek, and it took every ounce of my will not to recoil as if his hand were a snake. I looked into his eyes I had once thought were full of love, and saw the void behind them. "That sounds lovely, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm just a bit tired. I think I'll take that nap now." As I turned away, I felt the click inside me. The heat of my grief was being replaced by something else, a hard, icy core of resolve. He thought I was a spoiled girl who didn't know the value of what I had. He was about to find out that he had vastly underestimated the daughter of an architect. I knew how to build, but I also knew exactly which pillars to kick out to make the whole house come crashing down on his head. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare, though Mark didn't know he was the target. I played the part of the exhausted, grateful wife to perfection. I let him bring me tea. I let him pat my hand, and I watched with a detached, clinical horror as he and Evelyn whispered in the kitchen about the next phase. I spent every minute he was out of the house on the phone with a forensic accountant my grandmother had recommended, a man named Elias who spoke in the clipped, dry tones of a funeral director. "It's worse than the trust fund, Daria," Elias told me on the third morning, his voice crackling over the line. "I've tracked the deed to your current home. You think you're living in a house you co-own? Look at the county registry I just emailed you. The title was transferred 2 months ago to a holding company called EV Holdings. That's your mother-in-law's initials. You're essentially a squatter in your own living room." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. The routine documents I'd signed while half-conscious from post-birth exhaustion hadn't just been for the trust. They had been the quitclaim deed to my own home. I felt a surge of bile rise in my throat. They weren't just stealing my past. They were making me homeless. That evening, Mark came home with a bottle of expensive champagne. He looked jubilant, his face flushed with a triumph he couldn't quite hide. "Big news, Daria," he shouted, throwing his keys on the counter. "The South Shore deal went through. We're moving. Pack your bags, honey. We've sold this place. We're going to a luxury villa on the coast." Fresh air for Lily, a fresh start for us. "Sold this place?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. To whom, Mark? And when did we decide to sell? He didn't miss a beat. Oh, a private buyer. Great price. I told you, I'm handling the heavy lifting. You just need to trust me. At that moment, the front door opened and Evelyn swept in, draped in a new cashmere coat that probably cost more than my car. She was beaming. Isn't it wonderful, Daria? A new beginning. I'll be moving into the guest wing of the new villa to help with the baby. It's what family does. The room seemed to shrink. The air became heavy with the scent of her expensive, cloying perfume. I looked at the two of them, the man I had loved and the woman who had birthed him, and I saw them for the predators they were. They weren't moving me to a villa. They were moving me to a gilded cage where they could keep me quiet while they spent the rest of my father's hard-earned legacy. I found the blue folder, Mark, I said. The words fell into the room like stones dropped into a still pond. The silence that followed was absolute. Mark's smile didn't just fade, it disintegrated. His face turned a sickly shade of gray, and the bottle of champagne he was holding suddenly looked ridiculous, a prop from a play that had just been canceled. The blue folder? He stammered, his eyes darting toward the stairs, toward the nursery where the briefcase was hidden. Project Phoenix, I continued, stepping toward him. My heart was pounding, but my voice was a blade, cold and sharp. I know about the trust fund. I know about the condo. I know you forged my signature while I was recovering from a C-section. And I know you transferred this house to your mother. Evelyn was the first to recover. She stepped forward, her face contorting into a mask of righteous indignation. Now listen here, young lady. You have no idea how much debt Mark was in when you met him. He was drowning. We had to do something to protect the family interests. You were just sitting on that money, doing nothing with it. We put it to work. You stole it, I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. You stole from me. You stole from your own granddaughter. It's for the baby's future, Daria. Mark finally found his voice, but it was weak, a pathetic whine. The South Shore project will double that money. I was going to put it all back, I swear. I just needed a bridge loan, and since the banks wouldn't give it to me... So you used your wife as a bank? I stepped into his personal space, watching him flinch. You drugged me with those congratulatory smoothies so you could move my hand across a page? You let your mother wear my mother's jewelry while I wore rags? Mark didn't look at me. He dropped his gaze to the floor, his shoulders slumping. He looked small. For the first time, I saw the coward behind the charm. He didn't have the courage to even defend his own theft. He just stood there, paralyzed, while his mother took over the fight. Don't you dare take that tone with him, Evelyn hissed, her eyes narrowed to slits. You were a nobody until he married you, an architect's daughter with a bit of change in her pocket. He gave you a life. He gave you that child. If you try to make a scene, Daria, remember whose name is on the deed to this house. I can have you and that screaming infant on the sidewalk in 20 minutes. You have nothing. No money, no home, no proof that isn't your own signature on those documents. I have the folder, Evelyn, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly calm. That folder is in my briefcase, which is in my house, she retorted, a cruel smile touching her lips. And Mark is going to go upstairs right now and get it. Aren't you, Mark? Mark didn't move. He looked like a statue of a man who had lost his soul. Mark! Evelyn barked. He looked up, his eyes glassy. Daria, please, just Let's just go to the villa. We can fix this. I'll make it up to you. Don't ruin everything now. We're so close. Close to what? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and disgust. Close to finishing me off? Close to making sure I'm so dependent on you that I can never leave? Is there another woman, Mark? Or is it just the money? He winced as if I'd struck him. There's no one else. I did it for us. You did it for yourself, I corrected him. And you did it because you're a weak man who couldn't handle a woman who had more than you. You didn't want a partner. You wanted a donor. I turned to Evelyn, who was now reaching for her phone. Call whoever you want. Call the police. Call your lawyers. But before you do, you should know one thing. I didn't just find the folder. I found the emails, Evelyn. The ones where you talked about pulling the walls down around me. And I've already sent copies to Elias and my grandmother's legal team. Evelyn's face went white. The phone in her hand trembled. You little bitch. That's the first honest thing you've said to me in 3 years, I replied. I looked at Mark one last time, the man I had once thought was my protector. He was still silent, his eyes fixed on a spot on the rug, his silence a louder betrayal than any of his lies. He wouldn't fight for me. He wouldn't even fight for himself. I'm leaving, I said, turning toward the stairs to get Lily. And when I come back, it won't be with a suitcase. It will be with a process server. You're going nowhere, Evelyn shouted, stepping in front of the stairs. This is my house. Move, Evelyn, I said, my voice like ice. Or the next person I call won't be a lawyer. It'll be the fraud department at the IRS. I've seen the tax returns for EV Holdings. You haven't declared a dime of the investment income you stole from me. How do you think you'll look in orange? It won't match your pearls. She froze. The power dynamic in the room shifted so violently, I could almost hear the air crack. She stepped aside, her chest heaving with silent rage. I walked past her, my head held high, though my heart was breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard Mark finally speak, his voice a broken whisper. Daria, wait. I didn't even turn around. Wait for what, Mark? The next smoothie? I went into the nursery, picked up my sleeping daughter, and felt a sudden, fierce warmth spread through my chest. The victim was dead. The spoiled girl was gone. I didn't know how I was going to get it all back, but as I looked at Lily's innocent face, I knew one thing. I would burn their world to the ground to build her a better one. The cold night air hit my face like a splash of glacial water as I stepped off the porch, Lily tucked tightly against my chest. I didn't look back at the house, the museum, as Evelyn had called it, where my husband and mother-in-law were likely already tearing through the nursery, looking for the documents I had already safely stowed in my car. My hands were steady on the steering wheel as I drove back to my grandmother's cottage. The shaking had stopped. In its place was a heavy, cold weight, like a stone at the bottom of a well. The girl who had married Mark, the girl who wanted to be taken care of, who believed in the fairy tale of the provider, died somewhere between the nursery and the front door. When I walked back into Sophia's kitchen, she didn't ask how it went. She saw the look in my eyes, the way I moved with a sudden, sharp purpose, and simply poured me a cup of black coffee. Elias, the forensic accountant, was already there, sitting at the small wooden table with a silver-haired woman I didn't recognize. Daria, this is Margaret, Sophia said, her voice sounding younger, energized by the fight. She's the most ruthless divorce and estate attorney in the state. She's also a woman who hates a thief. Margaret didn't offer a warm smile. She offered a thick manila folder. Elias has been busy, she said, her voice like gravel. We don't just have the emails, Daria. We have the trail. Mark was using your father's trust money to pay off gambling debts and back taxes on his mother's apartment before he even started this South Shore project. It wasn't an investment, it was a heist. And because he used a shell company in his mother's name to funnel the money, we have them both on conspiracy to commit fraud and aggravated forgery. I don't just want the money back, I said, my voice sounding hollow and metallic. I want them to feel the walls closing in, exactly the way they did to me. I want them to know it was me who pulled the lever. The transformation was complete. Over the next month, I became a ghost in my own life. I stayed at Sophia's, ignoring the hundreds of frantic texts and calls from Mark. He went from, honey, please come home, let's talk, to, you're being hysterical, you're ruining Lily's life, to, finally, I'll sue you for kidnapping. I didn't reply to a single one. Instead, I worked with Margaret to freeze every account associated with EV Holdings. We filed for an emergency injunction, locking the title on the Colonial House and the South Shore property. Because the condo sale had involved forged documents on a federally insured trust, we quietly alerted the district attorney's office. I wasn't just filing for divorce. I was building a cage. The final confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley or a courtroom, but in the plush, mahogany-paneled boardroom of the bank where it had all started. Mark and Evelyn had been summoned there under the impression they were resolving a clerical error regarding the South Shore funding. They walked in looking smug, Evelyn in a new silk suit, Mark checking his watch as if his time were still valuable. When they saw me sitting at the head of the table with Margaret and two men in dark suits from the DA's office, the color drained from Mark's face so quickly I thought he might faint. Daria? Mark stammered, his eyes darting toward the exit. What is this? Why are you here with lawyers? Sit down, Mark, I said. I didn't stand up. I didn't scream. I just looked at him with the same clinical curiosity one might show a particularly unpleasant insect. And tell your mother to stop clutching her purse. The accounts are already frozen. There's nothing in there but air. You have no right, Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking. That money is ours. We worked for it. We managed those assets while you were sitting around being a mother. You didn't manage assets, Evelyn, Margaret said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. You laundered an inheritance. These are the original signatures from the hospital records the day Daria gave birth. And these are the signatures on the withdrawal forms. They don't match, not even close. And then there's the matter of the $300,000 from the condo sale that disappeared into your personal offshore account. That's called embezzlement. The room went silent. Mark turned to his mother, his mouth hanging open. Offshore account? Mom, you said that money went into the South Shore escrow. You said... Evelyn turned on him, her face twisting into a snarl. Shut up, Mark. You were too weak to do what was necessary. I had to secure our future. Our future? Mark whispered. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, looking for the woman who used to forgive him everything. Daria, I didn't know. I didn't know she took it all. I thought we were building something. Please, talk to me. I waited for him to say more. I waited for him to stand up and take responsibility, to apologize for the drugging, for the lies, for the way he let me shiver in a cold house while his mother bought sapphires. But he just sat there, his shoulders hunched, waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. The moment of silence stretched on until it became a physical weight in the room. He had nothing. He was nothing. "The police are waiting in the lobby, Evelyn," I said, leaning forward. "They have a warrant for the forgery and the fraud. But I'm feeling generous. If you sign over the deed to the colonial house and return the remaining balance of the trust today, I'll tell the DA that I'm not interested in pursuing the civil damages, which would leave you with enough money for a very small, very drafty apartment in the city. If you don't, well, I've always wondered how silk scarves look with a prison jumpsuit." Evelyn looked at the men from the DA's office. She looked at her son, who was crying silently. She looked at me and saw that the spoiled girl was gone. She signed. 6 months later, the air was crisp and clear as I sat on the porch of a new house. Not the colonial, which I had sold the moment the title was cleared, but a smaller, sturdier craftsman home overlooking the valley. The scent of jasmine was replaced by the honest, clean smell of pine and damp earth. I wasn't wearing worn shoes anymore. I was wearing boots that could handle the mud of a new life. Lily was crawling on a thick, handmade rug in the living room, her laughter echoing through the house. Mark was gone, living in a studio apartment, working a retail job to pay the child support he could barely afford, his visionary career ruined by the fraud charges that, while reduced, stayed on his record like a permanent stain. Evelyn had vanished into the obscurity of a cheap retirement home, her gold jewelry sold to pay for her defense. I walked inside and picked up a framed photograph of my father. I had used the recovered funds to start a scholarship in his name for young architects, specifically women who wanted to build their own futures. I had learned that security wasn't something a man could give you in a silk-wrapped package. It was something you built with your own hands, brick by painful brick. I sat down at my desk, opening a new set of blueprints for a project I was consulting on. I took a deep breath, feeling the stillness of the house, a stillness that wasn't empty, but full of possibility. I realized then that betrayal had been a fire, but I wasn't the one who had burned. I was the one who had been forged. The world is full of people who think that kindness is a weakness and that silence is a surrender. They learn too late that the most dangerous person you can ever cross is a woman who has finally realized she doesn't need your permission to exist.